Thank God for that. Well, it's been an interesting year this year. If anyone remembers, on the 1st of January, Trump started his campaign, launching a raid on Maduro, the president of Venezuela, removing him from power. Does anyone have the... Oh, there it is. Is that the clicker? Cool. Let me get it. Yep, 1st of January. This is what happened. It's hard to remember. There's so many things that have happened. And then the war in Ukraine, it continues to roll on. It seemed like it'll never end. It was meant to be a short campaign. It's turning out to be much longer than that. Conflict in the Middle East has erupted, as we all know, and who knows where it's going to go now with the Strait of Hormuz. Is it open? Is it closed? Is it going to be World War III? We don't know. Not to mention, just a few years ago, we've wanted to forget about it, but COVID-19, the worldwide pandemic, we didn't know if the world was going to end. And we didn't know if the world would be ever the same again. And I'm not sure if things are extra crazy right now, or maybe they were just always crazy and we just didn't realize it. We were distracted. Well, it may not be at the forefront of your mind, but on some level, we're all not really optimistic about the future, are we? What if something really, really bad happens? We're all afraid of the future on some level because we don't know if terrible things will happen to us or not. That's the reality. Uncomfortable, but it's the reality. But even in light of this, what can we do when the future looks bleak? Is there anything that can be done? Well, what can give us hope? Well, today the book of Daniel tells us that we can remember that God is in control and he will make sure his people will prevail in the end. Sorry, I missed a few things. God is in control and he will make sure that his people will endure to the end. Well, this is a really big claim, but how can we know this? How can we be sure of this? Well, in very hard circumstances, this is exactly the message that God gives to the prophet Daniel, which we read about earlier. But how does he communicate this to him? Well, it happened to Daniel. What happened? Well, what was happening around Daniel's time anyways? Well, let me give you a little bit of the background. So Daniel is set in the 6th century BC, so 6 centuries before Jesus. So in the year 586 BC, the last remaining kingdom of Israel, the kingdom of Judah, the southern kingdom of the Israelites, which was the only one left over, was attacked by the army of the mighty Babylonian king, the political superpower of the time. And as they were in the practice of doing, they would, to further increase the strength of their kingdom, they would deport all the skilled people, all the elites of the country, all the skilled artisans, and in order to prevent an uprising and also to strengthen and enrich their kingdom, the Babylonian kingdom. They would scatter people to different places, often bringing people, the most elite people, to Babylon, the capital city of their vast empire. So there, Daniel and his 3 companions were brought. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That's a mouthful, but I think they love mouthful names in this kingdom, if you know that. So they were educated, trained up by the most educated people in the ancient world on topics like language, ancient religion, mathematics, astrology, administration, for the purpose of raising up the best stock they could to be advisors to the king of Babylon, the royal Babylonian court. And usually the advisors were pretty expendable. They were useful, but when they weren't useful, well, they were gone. But through God's miraculous blessing of Daniel and his companions, they became very powerful and influential in the kingdom of Babylon, in the high court. So in particular, Daniel becomes one of those close advisors to the king of Babylon at his prime. And while Daniel rises to power, God is constantly communicating through him and his friends to the people of Babylon and the kingdoms that were controlled by it, and also the remaining Israelite people, reminding them who was actually in control. God was in control, even though the Israelite people and the Israelite nation was defeated. So here in the second half of the book of Daniel, there's 4 increasingly wild visions, and God continues to communicate to Daniel and the Israelites concerning the future of how God's people will fare in the dramatic rising and falling of kingdoms. Who knew something written so long ago, more than 2,000 years ago, could be so relevant today? Well, today we're going to look at the first of these visions. Let me retell fairly briefly what this vision is about. So let's recap the vision. What happens in the vision? Well, this is what happens. In the first year of King Belshazzar, the king of Babylon, Daniel has a dream, and as he was lying in bed, and he thinks it's important, so he writes it down. What is the content of the dream? And in the dream, it was nighttime, and in front of him were the four winds of heaven, churning up the great sea. So the biggest sea for an Israelite and people in the Mediterranean area is probably the Mediterranean Sea, but we don't know. But notice the four winds are from heaven, and they were creating the storm. And out of that sea came four gigantic beasts. How could we forget about them? Each of them different from the others. Lots of fuel for this on the internet. So if you ever want to look for this, there's lots of hours of looking at pictures. So the first was like a lion, and it had mighty wings like an eagle, but its wings were torn off. And it was lifted up and stood up on the ground on its 2 feet, kind of like a Ken doll, and it was given the mind of a human being. After that came out of the sea a second beast. One looked like a gigantic bear. It was raised up on one side, and it was as if it was about to strike, and 3 ribs of meat were on its teeth. And it was told by someone, "Get up and eat your fill of flesh." I've been watching this TV show called Something Bit Me, and any story people tell me of encounters with bears, well, if they want to eat something, they probably will. So after that, Daniel saw another beast. This is this time fearsome, but maybe less fearsome, but more strange. So you've got the leopard with the 4 heads and the 4 wings like birds. But even though this one arguably is less fierce, it was really strange. Had 4 heads. I don't know if you've ever seen a leopard with 4 heads, but it's probably unlikely. And it was given authority to rule. And after that, Daniel saw a 4th beast looming out of the night. And this one is the one that's most varied when you look it up on the internet. No one exactly knows what it is. It's more terrifying than all the others, though, and it's very powerful. It has large iron teeth and bronze claws, and it crushed and devoured everything that came in its way, everyone it saw. It was a beast of absolute destruction. This last beast also had 10 horns on its head, but Daniel, before Daniel could make sense of the 10 horns, another little horn popped up, and this is even weirder. So it uprooted 3 horns and up grew a little horn. But this horn wasn't just a horn. It had human eyes on it and a human mouth, and it spoke boastfully. I guess what the horn lacked in size, it made up for in boastful words. But this vision wasn't full of ferocious beasts. That's what we usually remember. But finally in the dream, something even greater happens. The royal court of God is assembled. Daniel is very familiar with this kind of thing because he worked in the royal court of the Babylonians, which is massive. And someone called the Ancient of Days, who's wearing clothing as white as pure snow and has a head full of woolly white hair, which probably explains why he's called the Ancient of Days. He sat down as the judge, and his throne was on fire. And the wheels of the chariot which are on the throne are on fire, and a river of fire is flowing from this judgment throne. So this is the imagery we get in the Old Testament prophets, of God coming in judgment. And Daniel saw thousands upon thousands attending this king and judge. 10,000 times 10,000. So for the engineers out there, that's 100,000. So the court was seated and the books were opened, ready to pronounce judgment on presumably the 4 beasts and possibly the whole world. But ironically, the overcompensating horn, the little horn, it keeps spurting out boastful words against God. But God has enough of this insolence of this little horn, and the 4th beast, is destroyed and thrown down into the judgment fire by God. And the other beasts are stripped of their authority as well, but they live for a little bit longer. But the vision is still not over yet. Out of the darkness comes one like the Son of Man. someone who looks like a human being coming with the clouds of heaven, with heavenly authority. He approaches the great judge, the Ancient of Days, or God, and he lets him come close to him. And even gives him authority and great honor and allows him to rule. He makes him king of all the world, and everyone in the world worships him. Daniel sees that this human king is given a kingdom that will never be destroyed. It will last forever. And the other beasts, like I said, stripped of authority, were allowed to rule for a little while longer. But after Daniel tells this dream, do you know when you have those dreams and then you kind of zoom out from that dream, you think you're going to wake up, and then another dream happens? Well, this is kind of what happens with Daniel. Daniel has a dream, he steps away from it. There's others who also see the dream, angels, we think, probably angels, and he asks them, what does this dream mean? And conveniently, the angel does know what's happening, and he tells him, and he said, you see the 4 great beasts, actually 4 great kings, that will rise to power on the earth. But the holy people of the Most High God will receive the kingdom of the world and keep it forever and ever. Daniel then asked about the 4th beast because it terrified him the most, probably because it destroyed everything it saw indiscriminately. And Daniel also wanted to know about the 10 horns on its head, especially the tiny little horn. So Daniel asked about these because they looked more threatening and dangerous for his people and everyone than anything else in the dream. And so it has eyes and a mouth like a human, and it spoke boastfully. And Daniel even saw this horn waging war against his holy people, or the holy people, and defeating them. But thankfully, Daniel saw that the Ancient of Days, who could be no other than God is the oldest being in existence, and he comes and he judges the fierce little horn in favor of God's people. And then when the time came, God gives the kingdom of the world to his people. And the one Daniel approaches, or the angel explains that the 4th beast, the 4th kingdom, is one that will rise in the earth and will be different from the others, and it'll be incredibly powerful, devouring the whole world, or the whole known world then, trampling it down, crushing it, ruling it through brutal military power. And the 10 horns on its head are 10 different kings that arise from this kingdom. And the one little one will arise from among them. And this king will speak against the Most High God himself and oppress his holy people to try and change set times and laws. So it will impose laws on the Jewish people about religious festivals. It will outlaw circumcision and the Sabbath, things like that, try and subsume them in their kingdom just as ordinary citizens. So God will let his people be oppressed by this king for a good amount of time. But then God will judge this king, and his power will come to an end, and his kingdom will be destroyed, and all the kingdoms of the world will be handed over to God's people. God will rule over kingdoms of the world with his people forever, and all the people of the world will worship and obey him. So Daniel's deeply disturbed by this vision. His face turns completely pale because it means horrible things for his people in the future. But he kept this dream to himself. But obviously not forever, because we have it today. Well, that was Daniel's dream. It was very wild. You might wonder, what was Daniel doing that night to have this dream? Well, God was visiting him. That's what was happening. Well, what does it all mean? Well, I think we can learn 3 things from this dream. 3 important things that God is trying to teach us today and teach people in the world. And this is what I think they are. What are the lessons it's teaching us? Well, the first one is that human kingdoms are terrifying, but God is still completely in control of them. Human kingdoms are terrifying, but God is still completely in control of them. So remember, in the dream, Daniel sees 4 different beasts. Well, what are these beasts? Well, to give you a spoiler, they're apex predators. They're not bunny rabbits and guinea pigs, but they're apex predators. That's why God depicts that's how God depicts 4 great kingdoms of the world. Likely the most powerful kingdoms in the ancient world. We can speculate what these kingdoms are exactly, and later in Daniel, God actually reveals who they are likely going to be or who they are, but that's not the point of this vision. So let's put that aside for the moment. So God's point in this vision, though, is that these powerful, dominating superpower kingdoms who are experts in destruction, war, and violence, they seem like they're really powerful. No one is going to be able to oppose them. No one is going to be able to stop them. But the reality is, they're not in control, are they? For example, the lion with the eagle's wings, well, those wings are ripped off, and it stood up like a human being. And other like the last beast, it gets judged, doesn't it? It doesn't get to be in control itself. And even the bear, it's told to eat its fill of flesh. It doesn't do it by itself. Someone else seems to be in control. But who's in control? Who's behind the scenes in control? Well, it's God, isn't it? God on his majestic throne. That's the way it's always been. Who orders these kingdoms, even these great beasts, and they do as he pleases. Well, even though these are kings and kingdoms, for the most part, they don't seem like they're out to be against God. But from time to time, or out to be against God or his people, but from time to time they do pit themselves against God and his people, don't they? But even in these times, God shows himself to be the true ruler of his world, his kingdom, and he won't let his people be completely destroyed. That's what we see in history over and over again. And that's what God is saying that he'll do here. So in this vision, we see that though earthly kingdoms seem terrifyingly powerful, they're all ultimately subject to God's control. Though it might not seem that way all the time. The human kingdoms are terrifying, but God is still completely in control of them. That's the first thing that the vision teaches us. Another thing the vision teaches us, or God is teaching us from the vision, is that out of nowhere, God comes to help his people. Out of nowhere, God comes to help his people. So at the moment when God's people are being severely persecuted and oppressed and defeated by the small, nasty king of that fourth terrifying kingdom, the little horn even, God shows up out of nowhere to help his people. He shows up unexpectedly, seemingly just in time to help his people. I don't think God is trying to tell us that he's waiting for a certain little king to rise up and make life horrible for his people, and then he's going to suddenly return. That might be the case, but I don't think that's what God is necessarily saying. But what we do know is that Jesus appears out of nowhere, doesn't he? Oops. Jesus appears out of nowhere, just at the right time to come and save the world and turn God's people back to him. What I think God is trying to communicate from this vision is that even if people suffer horribly under an oppressive ruler who pits themselves against God and his people, it'll be okay. Because God will come back in the end and judge in their favor and allow them to rule with him forever. In the New Testament, we learn that through Jesus' resurrection and also the resurrection of all who trust in him in the end, God's people will begin to rule the world. Then God's people who trust him, even if they're persecuted, even if they're killed by people who hate God, they still will be able to rule with Jesus forever afterwards. How does God finally rescue his people? Well, it's through this Son of Man, isn't it? Who comes with the clouds of heaven. Through a human who comes with heavenly authority and can rule the world perfectly under God, as God intended. Well, notice the beasts that we saw earlier. The first one and the last one in particular, or there's spatterings of this throughout the different beasts. They all have these strange human-like characteristics, but they clearly aren't human. So, like one stands up on 2 feet and is given the mind of a human being, the lion, and the last beast, or the horn, is given eyes and a speaking mouth, like a human. Well, what does this mean? Well, I think it means it's meant to symbolize how God allows these kings to think they're actually the rightful rulers of the world. They're meant to rule, and God has appointed them as the rulers of the world, the rightful rulers. And they do rule the world for a while, even large parts of the world. But they aren't the rightful rulers of the world, are they? Because they rule the earth through violence and injustice and rebellion against God. They act like literally wild animals. And they're never fully human, even though they're allowed to take on human-like characteristics. Well, it communicates with us. That's not God's plan. That's not God's plan forever. God's plan in the Bible, from the very beginning, is that human beings are the rulers over his creation under him in his way, not animals and not in a manner that's like animals. So God promises that a fully rightful human ruler will come to rule over God's kingdom forever at the end. And this rightful ruler over God's kingdom is none other than Jesus, who's already come, who comes as a human, but also comes as one who shows that he's fit to rule the world perfectly under God, who rules rightly and fairly through authority and not injustice and violence, who as the perfect ruler is even willing to die for his people, to die for the sins of all his people, to rescue them. What a great king. I know this passage doesn't talk about this specifically, but we can fill in the gaps from the New Testament and what we learn later through Jesus and other people teaching. And we learn that God allows this man, Jesus, to come near to him after his resurrection and enter into his presence and gives him the authority to rule the whole world. Jesus is this rightful ruler of the world who's now come and begun to rule and will return to rule the world forever with God's people at his second coming, when he resurrects all who trust in him forever. So the human who finally comes to rule with heavenly authority and glorifies and reflects God perfectly as they rule the world under God. The human ruler Jesus even deserves the worship of all people, being himself God. He can rule forever because he has eternal life. So out of nowhere, God appears to help his people through Jesus. Out of nowhere, God has come to help his people. That's also what we learn from the passage. And lastly, the third thing we learn is that God's people will surprisingly prevail and endure forever. God's people will surprisingly prevail and endure forever. So in Daniel's eyes, God seems to have been defeated since the country where God's people live has been decimated and they're exiled to all different places in the Babylonian kingdom. It seems like Israel and Israel's God are pretty weak. That's how people thought of the world in the ancient days. If God is powerful, then he can protect his people and stop them from being destroyed. But in the book of Daniel and through Daniel, God is trying to show people that despite the fact that his people have been defeated and scattered everywhere and destroyed, that God is still in control. God is still the creator God who is in complete control and deserves the worship of all people on the earth. But not only that, God will ultimately protect his people. He'll hand over the kingdom of the whole world to his people when he comes to judge the world. And that kingdom he sets up at the end of time on earth will last forever. And everyone on earth will be made to worship God. So even though at Daniel's time, people looked around and they saw these terrifyingly powerful kingdoms ruling the world, even though we might look around today and think, where's God? We might think God doesn't seem to care about his people. They're suffering terribly. Why doesn't he act? You might even think of Christians in Nigeria who are being beheaded for being Christians by extremists. Well, does this all mean that God is not God? That God is not in control and that he won't look after his people? No, it doesn't mean that. God can look after his people, and he will. God is in control, even today, even in the future. In the end, it will be clear that God is in control and he'll make sure that his people prevail in the end. Even though we might look around today and think, where's God? Yeah, God's still in control. Well, but as we are, as human beings, we, like Daniel, might look around in the world and see that it's still pretty terrifying. And sometimes it's right to think that. But even though this is the case, we can know that God is in control of the ultimate outcome of the world. He's in control of everything that happens right now and will use it for his purposes. He will look after his people. He's in control. Sorry, I think I lost my spot. Well, you might look at this vision and think, something written 2,500 years ago, how is it relevant for us today? Well, it turns out it's very relevant for us today. As we look at our world and the horrible looming realities that hang over our head, you might think of world war or climate crisis, potential human extinction. How can we know that things will be okay? Well, we can know that things will be okay because God is in control. We can know that God is even in control over powerful, terrifying human kingdoms and different worldwide phenomena, even natural disasters. We know this because in the Bible, in Psalm 33, verse 6, it says, "By the word of the Lord the heavens were made, their starry host by the breath of his mouth." By the breath of his mouth, God made everything that we know and see, even the moons that we can try and fly around. We do fly around. Well, surely if God can speak and make the universe with his words, then he can help us no matter what happens. He can help us even if the worst thing in the world, the worst thing we could imagine happens. As I said earlier, though human kingdoms are usually not in direct opposition to God, unfortunately, sometimes they do pit themselves against God and people who follow Jesus. But even when that happens, we can know that in the end we'll be okay if we trust God. There's no need to despair in any situation because God is in complete control. And God will be victorious over all human kingdoms and will ultimately rule forever. If we trust him, we will be a part of his kingdom. Remember that all powerful human kingdoms, as well as all people, we're all subject to God. So ask God to do something about the situations that we could never dream to change or influence in our favor. But God can because he's in control. So pray to the God who's in control. Also remember that God cares about his people and will judge the world in their favor. But like I said earlier, sometimes it's right to be terrified and anxious in some ways about the things in our world, but not to the point of despair. Because God is in control and he promises his people will endure and be victorious in the end. Know that God has a plan for all human history and his people, and it's a good plan. Well, in light of this, how can we think of the smaller things? It might be annoyances, it might be crisis in our life, like relationship breakdown, conflict at work. Well, in comparison, those things might seem quite small now. But also there are other things in life, I'm sure, they're not so small and they are hard and you're not sure how you're going to cope with them. But even with these things, we can trust God. And even if they don't go perfectly, we need to know that it's okay. It's not the end of the world. So if God is committed to helping his people, we need to commit to knowing and serving God. He is the prevailing reality that will outlast wars and trouble and crises. And for the people who trust him, who will prevail to the end, in the end, into eternity where they will not be able to be shaken by any more crises. Look around. Does anyone else offer that kind of hope? Can anyone else promise that? Well, no, they can't. All promises are empty in comparison because nobody can be certain enough to offer that kind of hope except God. So if you don't have that kind of hope and assurance, if you're not a Christian sitting here today, I want you to know that Christianity is not an exclusive club. Everyone's invited. You can join in this great hope that we have. If you want to know how to do that, we'd love to chat to you. Myself, maybe Graham or Matt would love to chat to you about that if that's something you want to talk about. Well, as we finish up, we might be on the brink of World War III. But if not, something terrible is bound to happen at some point in our lifetimes. What are we going to do then? How are we going to cope? Well, we're all afraid of the future on some level because we don't know if terrible things will happen to us or not. But what can we do even if these things happen? Well, what can we do when the future looks bleak? Well, we can remember that God is in control and he will make sure that his people prevail in the end. God is in control and he will make sure that his people prevail in the end. Let's pray. Dear Lord, I thank you so much that you are in control. And I pray that we as people who are not, that we might trust you. Help us in this world to put our trust in you. Though things look bleak. Help us trust you with the small things in our lives, with the hard things in our lives. Help us trust you with things that we couldn't dream to have any control over. Help us to know that in it you want us to trust you, to trust Jesus. And that if we do that, we're secure for the future. And so, Lord, I pray that we might remember that and we might allow that to drive us in our lives and give us motivation. Please help us to share this with others, that they might be spared in this tumultuous and difficult world that we live in. In Jesus' name we pray.